Thank you so much for taking the time to come and hear us out on a Saturday. I know it's a very precious weekend, but I'm very happy to see so many of you here in person and also online, so that we can talk to you about the work of the United Nations in support of disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. My name is Aaron Yu, as Youngji mentioned. I am the Deputy Director of the UN Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament in Asia and the Pacific, located in Kathmandu, Nepal. We are the regional center of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs. The Office for Disarmament Affairs, headed by the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mrs. Yuni Nakamitsu, is located in New York, headquartered in New York, but we have offices in Geneva, Vienna, Kathmandu, Lima in Peru, and also Lomé in Togo. So we have these regional centers that cover different parts of the world, and our office located in Kathmandu covers 43 countries in Asia and the Pacific, and I will come to those details in a bit later. So in today's brief remarks that I will be delivering, if I can get this to work. It's not meant. There we go. Thank you. So we did create a short video explaining what disarmament is. I'm sure that all of you have heard of the word disarmament. And it's not a very a word that we use in our daily lives. It's actually quite new. What is disarmament? It could mean something from taking away, or not taking away, but relinquishing your arms, but it also means to reduce spending on military expenses, and it also means elimination of weapons of mass destruction. And it encompasses a variety of concepts that the United Nations strive to work towards a more peaceful society in the global community. And so we did create a short video that shows you what disarmament is. Maybe you've seen it before, maybe you haven't, but hopefully this will be very helpful. I will go over the key instruments of the disarmament machinery, especially with particular relevance to the Asia Pacific region. And then my colleague Stephen will talk about how it is related to the SDGs. So the UN, because the SDGs is a development goal, the work of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs is more focused on the security pillar, but there are interlinkages between these two pillars, especially when it comes to Goal 16, and it's particularly relevant to 16.4. And UNODA is the co-custodian of 16.4 with UNODC, Office on Drugs and Crimes. And we will go into more detail on how that relationship works and how we contribute to the goal 16.4. But first, let's have a quick look at the video. Can I just play? Is it all connected?
Disarmament in the 21st Century, an overview of the pillars of the disarmament agenda. In 2018, United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres launched an agenda for disarmament. In a more complicated world where international tensions are rising and conflict continues, disarmament and non-proliferation have to be at the center of the United Nations work. The agenda bases these efforts on 4 key pillars, bringing the objectives of disarmament into the 21st century. 1. Disarmament to save humanity. Weapons of mass destruction pose an existential threat to us all. The work of the UN under this pillar focuses on securing us against the dangers of biological and chemical weapons and pursuing a world free of nuclear weapons. 2. Disarmament that saves lives. As deadly, destructive and complex conflicts continue to spread, we must also address the humanitarian impact of conventional weapons and provide effective regulation, from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas to the illicit trade in weapons and unsafe storage to a reduction in military spending. 3. Disarmament for future generations. Understanding the potential challenges posed by emerging technologies and fostering responsible innovation are key to securing the safety of generations to come. It is critically important that, no matter how technologies change, states remain committed to using them in accordance with international law, and that humans always maintain control over the use of force. 4. These objectives cannot be achieved alone. That's why the fourth pillar, strengthening partnerships for disarmament, recognizes that we are stronger when we work together, from the UN and member states to academic experts, civil society, industry, and individuals. It is through these four pillars that we can all work together and secure our common future.
Right, so as you've seen in the video, the Secretary General has announced his agenda for disarmament, which guides us in our work at the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, in partnership with our sister offices and agencies and programs and funds. So that disarmament agenda is consisted of 4 pillars: disarmament to save humanity, which talks about weapons of mass destruction, disarmament that saves lives, conventional weapons disarmament and arms control, disarmament for future generations on emerging technologies, youth outreach and disarmament education, and of course, strengthening partnerships for disarmament on how we can foster additional and new partnerships to strengthen our work along with civil society and women empowerment. So we'll go briefly through the pillars. First pillar, disarmament to save humanity. Weapons of mass destruction is a key core part of the work of the United Nations and the Office for Disarmament Affairs. And the video briefly mentioned it, but who can tell me what is a weapon of mass destruction? In Korean, it's 대량 살상무기. There are only 4 types of weapons that are in this category. Any guesses? Just shout it out. Nuclear weapons, yes. Chemical weapons. We just had a big pandemic. Biological weapons. Last one. Radiological weapons. So nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and radiological weapons, what we call CBRN weapons, are what we consider weapons of mass destruction, not only because it can cause immense harm to a large number of people at once, but also how inhumane these weapons are. You've probably seen reports coming out of Syria on the use of chemical weapons and how terribly people die when exposed to chemical weapons. You will see their skin blistering up, their lungs are filled with water because of the chemicals, and you literally suffocate and drown on dry land. So these are very horrid weapons that kill the people in a very inhumane way and are mostly banned by international law. Chemical weapons and biological weapons are completely banned under the Chemical Weapons Convention and also the Biological Weapons Convention. Nuclear weapons are also, well, we can't say it's legally banned because there are 5 nuclear countries that are recognized who are still mandated to do what they can to reduce and eliminate their nuclear weapons stockpiles. But there is also a new treaty with over 50 countries that have joined that also prohibits nuclear weapons. So the international legal work on banning nuclear weapons is still in progress, but we are doing what we can to push towards that ultimate goal of having a world free from weapons of mass destruction, and that is a core part of our mandate in UNODA. So, having talked about nuclear weapons, the global stockpile of nuclear weapons, as you see in the graph, is on a positive trend. Right? Since the height of the Cold War, when there was a serious arms race between the USSR and the United States, you see a peak. But after years of efforts from the United Nations, the first ever UN General Assembly resolution actually talked about the need to eliminate nuclear weapons. So there has been constant push from the international community to abolish nuclear weapons. we are not there yet after 50 years, but we are going to the right direction, as you see in the number of stockpiles available, but the number of warheads in the world are still in a downward trend. I know there are some concerning developments, of course, with our brothers in the north. There are more countries that are seeking nuclear capabilities, which is very worrisome from our perspective. And that is why we are trying our best to dissuade countries from developing nuclear weapons, conducting nuclear tests, because of all the harm that it can bring to our global community. So having said that, on the nuclear weapons pillar of the WMD, there are a number of international mechanisms that are designed to curb the development of new nuclear weapons. One is the most famous one, is of course the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is where the big treaty where we have two groups of people, non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states. The treaty only recognizes 5 countries as nuclear weapon states, and these countries have an obligation to continue working towards disarmament of their nuclear weapons. But it does not say that you need to immediately do it. It recognizes the security environment at the time the treaty was adopted, and also towards until now. But it still gives them the obligation to eliminate what they have in the long term. But the treaty also obliges no new nuclear weapons shall be made by other states, and it's near universal. Most of the members of the United Nations are also members of the NPT, and they have committed not to use nuclear power to make weapons, but only to commit to use them for peaceful purposes. And in return, the treaty says, okay, since you have made this commitment to use nuclear energy and nuclear power only for peaceful purposes, we will assist you in building new nuclear power plants, with sharing technologies like medical technologies. The nuclear power and radiological power technologies can be very, very beneficial when used the correct way. Nuclear power plants are actually a very efficient way. There are, of course, discussions about whether or not they are climate and environmentally friendly, but you cannot deny that this is one of the most effective means of producing power at this point in technology. And at the same time, the medical uses of radiological technologies like X-rays, imaging machines, and also how there are many projects that are being run by the International Atomic Energy Agency about gene modifications of mosquitoes so that they won't transmit malaria anymore using radiological technologies. So there are many applications of radiological and nuclear technologies that are good for the development and prosperity of humankind, but we will only share and foster these technologies only with the promise that you will not abuse this technology for weapons purposes. So that's the whole background and context behind the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and this treaty is enforced and verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA headquartered in Vienna, Austria. And then the second treaty here on the slide is a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Now, this is a new treaty that only entered into force a few years ago. As I mentioned before, the nuclear weapon states do have an obligation to negotiate with each other and try to reduce the number of nuclear warheads. And that's what the US and USSR did since the times, and then the number of warheads have significantly been reduced. However, it's been over 50 years, right? But we still have nuclear weapons. Many states, many countries were frustrated at the slow progress of disarmament and have realized that, you know what, there is no international ban on nuclear weapons. The NPT is a bit vague on, so this, because there are 5 states that practically are allowed to keep nuclear weapons, does that mean it's legal or not? So that ambiguity was still there, right? So a number of states gathered together and said we need to have a new treaty that puts it out there and just puts it in law that nuclear weapons should ban. And that is a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Steve, I don't know if you can quickly check exactly how many countries are currently that have ratified the treaty. I think it's now 60 something. But the number of states that are joining the treaty are increasing. Unfortunately, the P5s, the nuclear five, have not yet joined this treaty with obvious caveats and reasons. But hopefully, this was another big step towards ensuring that the world still wants a world without nuclear weapons, to set a global norm that nuclear weapons will not be tolerated and is not wanted by the global society. So since this is the newest treaty that is out there, and it's a very big development in the international law and international community on nuclear weapons. If you're interested, I would highly encourage you to visit our website and read some articles about the TPNW. There are other mechanisms that talks about nuclear weapons, the FMCT, the CTBT, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that bans additional nuclear testing. These two treaties, unfortunately, are not yet in force, but yes, 68 state parties to the TPNW and the increasing 91 signatory states. Thanks. So FMCT and CTBT are not yet in force. This is due to the comprehensive nature of how it was designed. One mistake that the drafters of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty included in the treaty was that this treaty will not be meaningful until we have the most dangerous countries join this treaty. So the treaty requires a number of specific countries, including the United States, DPRK, and other states that potentially are seeking nuclear weapons capabilities to join. And before they join, the treaty is not yet met. And obviously, our brothers in the north are not very keen on joining these kinds of treaties. They haven't joined, and therefore the treaty is not yet met. So we are trying our best to advocate and push for more countries to join the treaty regardless, because we believe it is very important that no more nuclear tests are conducted. The harmful effects of nuclear testing is quite well known, and we believe this is against human rights and human security in the global community. So that's where we work on nuclear weapons. There, disarmament verification, and of course, nuclear weapons free zone is also another important mechanism that we ensure no nuclear weapons are introduced to a certain geographical area. Currently, in Asia, we have the nuclear free zones in Central Asia and in Southeast Asia, the Shamsas Treaty. South Pacific also is a nuclear weapons free zone, and Mongolia by itself announced its own territories as a nuclear weapons free zone, which means no nuclear weapons technologies are allowed in the country or in the territories of the treaties of the three zones, and nuclear weapons are not allowed to be stored in those areas. So I know in Korea, especially these days, with threats from the north, there are debates about whether or not South Korea should also have a nuclear weapon, which is very worrisome from the UNODA's perspective, because we believe that is not the way to solve the situation. Since you have a nuclear weapon, I'm going to have a nuclear weapon kind of approach is more like you have a gun, I will have a gun, so we will all be in a safer world. But that's not how it is in certain countries that allows that kind of gun proliferation. Would you feel safer when nobody has nuclear weapons or everybody has nuclear weapons? Answer to that question should be clear enough that we would be much safer in a world where nobody has nuclear weapons, and therefore the solution should be towards let's get rid of nuclear weapons, not let's have more nuclear weapons. That's how we advocate and we try to persuade decision makers that decisions like this should be made with a bird's eye view and long-term strategic thinking. It's not just because they have it, we should have it too. No, how do we ensure the safety and well-being of all of our citizens by cooperating and getting rid of all nuclear weapons. So I spent a lot of time on nuclear weapons, but chemical weapons and biological weapons as important in our work. Try to make sure that these two weapons, which are already categorically banned by international law, remain that way. We did have an unfortunate situation in Syria where it was reported that chemical weapons have been used, and which is a clear violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And Syria is a member and a party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So we really do not want to see that repeated. There is an international organization called the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, that plays the role of IAEA, the chemical field. So it is the one that sends inspectors, tries to find fact-finding missions, and provides guidelines to countries how to safely store chemical materials. It's a little bit more difficult to do this in the chemical field than the nuclear field, because for nuclear, it's quite clear what you need to control. Enriched uranium, definitely control, right? Enriched plutonium, definitely control. And even raw uranium, there are limited uses of what you can get from those materials. But when we come to the world of chemicals, it's really hard because we use chemicals in all sorts of manner and in a big number of quantities. For instance, chlorine is used everywhere. Like, our cleaning detergents use chloride. I think that's it, right? All these cleaning detergents, laundry detergents use a high quantity of chlorine. And if we want to produce these chloride in a big factory, we need to import or produce a large quantity of chlorine. But that same chlorine, if used in a malicious way, can be used as a weapon. And one of the weapons that were used in Syria was barrel chlorine bombs. And chlorine, when inhaled to a human body in a large quantity, will make your lungs flood and you will drown without actually being in water. So it is a banned chemical weapon. But again, how can we ban chlorine? We can't, because it's used everywhere. Oh, and it's safe to be used in certain circumstances. So it's a lot more difficult to control all the chemical material that are out there. But the OPCW does its best to ensure that all countries in the world have the right laws and regulations to make sure that they themselves can control how these chemicals are used and that they are only being used for peaceful purposes. And we try to also provide support in that sense by providing training, helping them draft and review their legal measures and regulations. And that's what the UN does to provide support to the implementation of the chemical weapons. And the same, of course, for the Biological Weapons Convention. One thing that I do want to highlight is, unlike the nuclear, the chemical side, on the bio side, unfortunately, we do not have a separate international organization that presides over the biological weapons. So we do have the World Health Organization, but they only focus on the public health side, not on security and weapons of biological material. In the absence of such an organization, UNODA plays the role of a secretariat to the Biological Weapons Convention, which means we provide meeting venues for the meetings of the parties, we provide documentation support for the parties, but we don't really have an organization that does verification, having experts to send to these kinds of silos and labs. There is no organization at this time that has a mandate to do these kinds of activities to make sure that the biological materials that are in our laboratories or anywhere else are not being used for weapons purposes. So that's something that we hope, I guess, one day we will be able to amend. And of course, space security and strategic weapons control. There are other areas beyond the weapons of mass destruction pillar that are relevant to weapons of mass destruction, such as outer space. And of course, the conference that Steve and I was just in Korea, the 21st UN Republic of Korea Joint Conference on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation issued. This year's iteration of the conference focused on outer space. So it's more about how do we make sure that outer space remains a peaceful realm and is not contested over and is not weaponized. So outer space is of course the key interest of us increasingly, because now we have technologies that are dependent on outer space. All of our GPS and communications technologies have some relations with our satellites, and therefore if somebody were to use these technologies for malicious purposes and start shooting down satellites of each other, and then it creates a huge debris field, and then all of our satellites would be knocked out. And it's not only two countries that are at war that is a problem, it becomes a global problem. So how do we prevent that? We need to have rules and norms and guidelines on how to behave responsibly in space. It's a bit similar to how we came to the current procedures when we have airplanes flying over each other's countries. The Montreal Convention and all these other international laws that govern how these aircraft should behave in order to ensure that it's not military planes that are flying over us. We don't shoot each other's planes down. There are certain warning protocols we do before we intercept. So these kinds of guidance and policies are required. We should make them also for outer space vehicles and behavior, is the whole point of this exercise. And of course, there are new types of weapons that are being used and researched, like the MREVs, the hypersonic light vehicles, and low-yield atomic weapons. Because weapons technologies is developing at a rapid pace, and there are no international rules and guidance and guidelines to ensure that they are not used in a malicious manner or be used by terrorists. We need to have international guidance and international agreements that are in pace with the development of weapons technologies. And that is the whole point of continuing these discussions in different forums, like the Conference on Disarmament, Earth Committee, and the General Assembly. The UN has different areas where we continue these kinds of discussion in different areas. New York, Geneva, Vienna. Okay, so I am going a lot slower than I had thought, so I will quickly skip through these. So the challenges on pillar 1 is, of course, the nuclear issue is a big challenge in the region because of DPRK. And we are praying that it won't happen, but it is likely that there will be a second nuclear test. And as you all know, even just yesterday, and then we had to, there were missiles being launched, so it's not a very safe situation. So we are working on those issues, rapidly increasing of technological expansion. Asia is one of the fastest growing region when it comes to technological development, and there are terrorist organizations active in the region. And of course, there were incidents of CBRN use in Japan, in Malaysia, and elsewhere. So that's a big area of our concern. Sorry, weapons of mass destruction is my portfolio area, so I have spent a lot more time than I had anticipated on that. But this does not mean that conventional weapons are not as important. The conventional weapons, disarmament that saves lives, is currently the weapons of mass destruction we weren't able to control through international regulations, and you haven't heard any additional use case of nuclear weapons, for instance, beyond the Hiroshima and Nagasaki case. So I think we were successful in suppressing that the usage of nuclear weapons. But when it comes to conventional weapons, more people have died by guns, or they have been killed by guns and weapons than nuclear weapons. So this is the Vatican, the representative of Vatican has a famous line that he always uses every year in the General Assembly, is that conventional weapons and small arms and light weapons are the actual weapons of mass destruction, because they kill more people in the world today than nuclear weapons. There are many mechanisms through through which we deal with conventional weapons, especially in small arms and light weapons control of illicit trafficking of guns and light weapons, drones, UAVs, IEDs, stockpile management, and promoting transparency in military expenditures. So when we talk about conventional weapons, we cannot not talk about the humanitarian consequences, as I just mentioned. We already have a number of conventions and international mechanisms that ban certain kinds of behaviors, like anti-personnel mines, non-detectable fragments, mines, booby trap, incendiary weapons, blinding laser weapons, explosive remnants of war. So there are certain conventional weapons that are deemed inhumane and should not be used. And the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons dictates what those inhumane weapons are and bans those weapons under international law. And of course, because of the rising threats from non-state actors, there's also a separate mechanism that deals specifically with terrorists and non-state actors, especially on improvised explosive devices and also the uncrewed aerial vehicles and also armed drones. The newest action on how to make sure that these weapons are not sold on the black market and are used in a non-conventional manner is the Arms Trade Treaty that was recently adopted and ratified. So we currently have in the region, you see a lot of whites still, where the region is still lagging behind the Arms Trade Treaty ratification. The whole point of the Arms Trade Treaty is to make sure that when we trade weapons, like there was a big news article in the Korean media about Korea defense contract with Poland, selling I think a bunch of tanks and weapons. Which, we were not saying that these weapons are not necessary for national defense purposes. All countries have defense and security needs and may have legitimate reasons to build and have weapons to defend its own people. But we need to make sure that when they cross border and are traded, they need to be traded between legitimate partners. So Korea can sell weapons to the Polish government, it should not be selling weapons to warlords in Africa, for instance. That's the whole point of the treaty. Let's make sure that these weapons are traded only between legitimate partners and only certain types of weapons that are not in the list of banned weapons are traded. Let's build a verification mechanism so that we can build transparency and so that the world can know what kind of weapons are being traded to which partners. So that's the whole point of the treaty. And here are the number of the treaty members. Again, this is all because we want to prevent the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons, which comprises a big part of SDG 16 and 16.4. And in order to help that, we have the UN Program of Action and of course MOSAIC, the Modular Small Arms Control and Communication Compendium, that is designed to help countries build laws and regulations to prevent illicit trafficking of small arms. And of course, military expenditures, in order to make sure that we keep an eye on how much money we spend on military, you will be surprised how much we spend on military compared to development. I think it's at least 20 times more money that we use on military. And you will see that Japan and South Korea are the 8th and 10th largest military spending countries in the world. So we do spend a lot of money on military equipment and weapons. Our argument is if you spend a fraction of that money to building hospitals and schools, we would have much better lives everywhere. So the challenges in the Asia Pacific, of course, there are currently conflicts ongoing in the region. And then, of course, post-conflict states still do not have secured their stockpiles. We also know that there are non-state actor groups, terrorists in the region. And of course, increasing strategic competition between big powers in the region are affecting the security environment. And of course, we don't call it an arms race yet, but the military expenditure of the regional countries are growing at a worrying pace. And of course, low levels of AT and other areas. So I don't want to take all the time, all of your time, but pillar 3 is on disarmament for future generations, which is one key area that we try to work because disarmament is something that people do not know about anymore, care about anymore, and we want to change that narrative and try to tell people it's still an important issue. Yes, we may not be living in a Cold War, right, where arms race is something that we care about every day, but still military expenditure, the military competition is still an area that we should keep an eye on. And all of you, especially the younger generation, need to know how much of your tax money are being spent on procuring military equipment. North Korea shot over 60 missiles this year. And that 60 missiles would cost over 10, I think, billions of dollars. And considering how poor North Korean ordinary people are living on the poverty line, if that money was to be used, productively, then it would have saved so many lives. So this is the kind of message that we want to continue to promote so that you understand the number that you see in the table. On the table, it's just numbers, but those numbers represent lives and people are starving, and so that kind of translation is what we try to do in our videos and our messages and our lectures, and that's what we are through pillar 3 by promoting that emerging technologies, including weapons technology, should be kept under control and in pace. Peaceful activities should be ensured in cyberspace, and of course, responsible innovation of science and technology so that they are not used for malicious purposes. And of course, keeping human in control of the use of force. This specific clause refers to killer robots and artificial intelligence making the decision whether or not to shoot. So it should always be a human being making a decision based on their national security policies and under strict orders that be allowed to shoot under extreme circumstances. So it shouldn't be a robot making decisions, this person deserves to die or not. So that is a debate that is ongoing in Geneva right now. So drones is also a problem in the area of emerging technologies, increased use of additive manufacturing, meaning 3D printing. You see a 3D printed gun over there. And then cyber attacks and cyber warfare, a new source of income for DPRK, which is now making sanctions a bit ineffective. Also, artificial intelligence and lethal autonomous weapon systems, that's what I meant by killer robots. And that is the ongoing debate in pillar 3 that we are working on as the United Nations.
There you go. Awesome.
Yeah. Okay. So lastly, strengthening partnerships for disarmament. This I will very briefly go over. Is that we are trying to seek coordination amongst disarmament bodies. As I've mentioned, I've thrown at you many acronyms: IAEA, BWC, ISU, CWC, and these all represent certain bodies and certain organizations that work on disarmament on a specific sector, right? Like nuclear weapons, chemical weapons. And we want to make sure that there are no duplications of efforts, and we want to make sure that our efforts towards disarmament is coordinated. So UNODA, as the main UN body responsible for disarmament coordination, is always in partnership and in communications with these organizations to ensure that our efforts are coordinated. And also, regional organizations play a big role. For instance, in Europe, there's the organization called OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. Africa has the AU. The Americas have the Organization for American States. This region, unfortunately, does not have a regional security organization. ASEAN is a sub-regional organization that focuses on economic cooperation, but not so much on security. So this is the one big challenge that we have in the region, that there is no security cooperative mechanism amongst countries, especially in Northeast Asia. There have been attempts to create one, but we, as a Korean myself, we do not feel comfortable at entering into a security collaboration with Japan and China. So that dream never materialized. And then, of course, establishing a platform where we can pursue equal participation of women in decision-making processes. Unfortunately, the area of disarmament is still a very male-dominated field. I'm assuming it's because of its relationship with the military aspects of things. But this is also something that we are trying really hard to push for. And of course, establishing a platform for youth engagement. I highly encourage you to search the hashtag Youth for Disarmament and Leaders for Tomorrow, I think it was. Yeah. Youth for Disarmament is ODA's youth group that are currently participating in global and worldwide campaigns. We also invite them to different disarmament conferences in New York, Geneva, and Vienna. So I think there will be opportunities, if you are interested in disarmament, for you to also apply for these opportunities and join us. And also, Leaders for Tomorrow is also a UN-led youth initiative on peace and security. And I think that's the last slide from my end. I know that the topic was quite intense in substance, and it was a bit heavy, but it's because our daily work deals with weapons and that kills people, and we tend to be a bit more technical than other organizations. But we still consider this a very political issue. It is a political issue because it deals with national security and international competition. So this is an area where you can really see the technicalities of weapons technologies, what kind of missiles were launched, how many kilometers can it fly, meet politics of the international society. Russia wants this, China wants that, and then that all relates somehow into the developing technologies. One prime example of why the United States is very sensitive about North Korea's missile launches is because of its developing capabilities to reach mainland US, right? These intercontinental ballistic missiles that the North Koreans are firing and testing are increasing its range every test. And that is becoming a security concern for the US. And now it's become from a technical issue to a political issue. So this intersection of technology and politics is quite prevalent in the world of disarmament. So if you are a student of political science, or if you're a student of security, international security, disarmament is definitely an area I would recommend you to look at. And of course, we'd be open and happy to answer any questions you may have on any other technical issues or political issues in the current international forum. Thank you so much.
So this goes out. I know it's great. Right. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Take off now.
Okay, thanks so much, Aaron. Good morning, everybody. My name is Steve Humphers. I'm also from the UNODA's Regional Center for Asia Pacific. First of all, thank you to WFUNA and everyone for organizing this. We're really happy to participate again. And especially thanks to you guys for coming here. I know it's a Saturday, so we're grateful that you guys want to come and listen to us, and we're grateful to come be here with you. I apologize if Aaron and I look a bit tired or worn out. We just finished a really grueling conference series, so we're trying to stay awake here as well. So I'm going to go into the second half of the presentation. This one will be a bit quicker. I think a lot of you guys have a lot of different interests in a few different SDGs, so I'm going to speak about them from the context of disarmament. and how disarmament itself relates to the SDGs. Whoops. There we go. So this is just kind of a big synopsis. It's actually kind of a spoiler of my presentation, so don't do it. Just, I'm just kidding. But the Secretary General's agenda for disarmament, which we just heard about, recognizes the important contributions that disarmament and arms control play towards achieving the 2030 SDGs. The agenda addresses 10 different SDGs in particular through various actions. Global security and sustainable development are intrinsically linked together. Human safety and security from war and violence are actually a precursor that needs to be achieved before you can have meaningful progress on many of the other SDGs. So let's take a greater look at the individual ones that are addressed by disarmament in more detail. So starting first with good health and well-being. So armed violence is among the leading causes of premature death all around the world. It victimizes even more people by spreading injuries, disabilities, psychological distress, and disease. Disarmament and arms control, of course, can help reduce the impact of conflict, which of course affects human health. Next up is SDG 4 on quality education. Limiting the proliferation of uncontrolled circulation of weapons in communities contributes to safe and secure learning environments for everybody. There's a lot of these topics that are actually really cross-cutting against several SDGs, which is something that makes disarmament especially important. Disarmament education itself, technically what we're doing today is disarmament education, so thank you guys for engaging on SDG 4. DE, as we call it for short, contributes to education on peace and nonviolence, conflict resolution, and sustainable development. Also, gender equality, economic justice, human rights, and the tolerance of cultural diversity. Moving on, and one of the most important ones, I think, is SDG 5, gender equality. Actually, Aaron and I mentioned when we walked into this room how impressed we are with the women present. This isn't something that, at least historically, has permeated to the highest levels of international politics in the UN, but it is something that is changing for the better, and it's because there's so many more young women interested in engaging in these issues, so kudos to you guys. Also, to the men, kudos to you guys as well. It's not meant to pick favorites, but it is good and refreshing to see more gender balance at all levels throughout these processes. Specifically with disarmament in Goal 5, so men and women are affected differently by proliferation and the use of weapons. That's not to say that there's any type of contest or trying to figure out who has it worse. It's just that there's unique effects for each of the genders. Young men are overwhelmingly responsible for the misuse and ownership of small arms, while men make up most of the direct casualties, something like 90%. I'm totally paraphrasing, so please don't write it down and send me a report somewhere. But men make up about 90 to 95% of small arms deaths, but they own almost 100% of the guns. What that means is that women, they're not killed as much as men, but they are killed disproportionately compared to the ownership of guns. In general, women don't own guns, but they still represent a disproportionate amount of deaths from armed violence. Regulating arms and ammunition can reduce violence against women and girls in both public and private spaces. And beyond that, empowering women and ensuring their equal and meaningful participation in disarmament and arms control decision-making processes can lead to more inclusive, effective, and sustainable policy outcomes. Aaron alluded to the point earlier that part of the reason traditionally disarmament and security have been inundated with men is because of its intrinsic connection to the military background. One of the old adages we hear a lot of times are, if you are a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And what that means in the context here is that part of the reason the UN works so hard to include greater diversity and inclusion in these processes is because it brings a wealth of different perspectives. Instead of everyone in the room having the same perspective and likely approaching the same conclusions, you bring gender diversity, geographical diversity, economic diversity, and you get a more holistic approach And that's something that the UN and UNODA is striving to do better in our own environments as well. Moving on to SDG 8. This is decent work and economic growth. So you heard a lot from Aaron about MILEX, the military expenditures. These excessive MILEXs can harm economic growth and produce undesirable social and consequences. Reducing military budgets can reduce the negative effects of the spending and hopefully increase positive economic spending and social development. Stemming the proliferation and easy availability of arms can counter the recruitment and use of child soldiers. These opportunities to build decent livelihoods can attract young men away from armed groups or armed violence. And finally, adequate arms regulation helps prevent the illicit transfer of weapons in support of human trafficking, modern slavery, and forced labor. On to SDG 10 on reduced inequalities. So again, this relates back to military expenditures, but disarmament can help to reduce and reallocate military expenditures, which of course has cascading effects into other areas across cutting SDGs. On to SDG 11, which is, I keep getting the exact name, and I can't read a lot of these languages, but there you go, sustainable cities and communities. So goal 11. Effective ammunition management mitigates the risk of storage depot accidents exploding in populated areas. This is one of the areas within our mandate at ODA. We go all over the world and help countries in execute effective stockpile management. So anywhere where they're building up military arms, police arms, ammunition. There's been a lot of tragic cases where these depots have actually had explosions because of improper storage or locking up weapons. And these, of course, cause great damage to cities and communities and infrastructure around them. So by taking on these effective arms control and ammunition management exercises, we help to increase progress towards 11. And these two are hand in hand. So I always like to put them together, but this is life below the water and life on land. So there's this kind of works in conventional and WMD respects. From the contamination from remnants of war and the testing of WMDs have disastrous environmental consequences. Speaking about conventional weapons, what we can see in this region, especially in Laos, Lao PDR, they have a massive issue with unexploded ordinances, which we call UXOs, that are left over from the Vietnam War. These are bombs that were dropped on Laotian territory during the Vietnam War, and a lot of them didn't actually explode. They become embedded in the soil and in the ground. And unfortunately, what happens is later on, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, even farmers, children, anyone can digging in these fields can come across these bombs and set them off and die. And this happens actually in Laos to around 50 people per year are maimed or killed by finding these unexploded ordinances. So this is a massive challenge for life on land. And it's actually estimated that only about 1% of the unexploded ordinances in that country have actually been identified and recovered. So it's quite an ongoing process. Onto the WMD side, there was some specific nuclear testing in the Bikini Atoll Islands in the South Pacific, which were conducted around the present-day Marshall Islands that have inflicted severe radiation sickness on local populations and the natural environment. And moving on to the number one SDG that we address is SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. This is our bread and butter at ODA. So, disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control can play a vital process in preventing conflict and forging sustainable peace. Some of the sub-targets we work with specifically on 16 are target 16.1, in which disarmament and arms regulation contribute to reducing deaths from armed violence by prohibiting and restricting the use of certain types of weapons and establishing effective controls of arms and ammunition. The next subpoint we work with very commonly is target 16.4, This is about the effective disarmament and arms regulations can reduce illicit arms flows, which can otherwise instigate, fuel, and prolong armed conflict, terrorism, and crime, like I mentioned earlier and that Aaron mentioned in his presentation. 16.4 is the most obvious SDG target for the work of ODA. In the region, our center, UNRCPD, we support member states by conducting a number of projects that are aimed to strengthen arms control regulations and to prevent the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons. Target 16.6, which deals with the developing effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. Participation in military transparency and competency building measures, such as reporting on military spending and on arms imports and exports, promote accountability of national institutions, and can foster cross-border dialogue and trust between countries. Target 16.8 deals with broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance, strengthening the institutional capacities of states to better control arms and ammunition, and to engage in military confidence measures helps prevent conflict, violence, terrorism, and crime. So, like I mentioned, SDG 16 is really where the focus of all our work is. The other SDGs, they're not any less important to us, but they're more addressed studying issue, whereas 16 is usually the focus of the majority of our programming, and we hope to try to address each of the other ones in turn as a result of the direct action we're doing for 16. And then the last SDG that we address, which is very commonly and very broadly addressed, is partnerships towards the goals. So mobilizing sufficient resources in support of disarmament and arms regulation is critical. Sorry, everyone online, if you can't hear me. Mobilizing sufficient resources in support of disarmament and arms regulation is critical to achieving 2030 SDGs. Increased availability of high quality, timely, disaggregated, and reliable arms-related data can inform discussions about the relationship between disarmament, development, peace, and security, which will lead to better decisions and better policies and hopefully more sustainable development for everyone. So that's everything. Thank you guys a lot for your time. Please, I have Aaron's email and my email up here. I also have our Twitter and Facebook for the center. Please feel free to reach out. You can ask any questions. I know we're going to go into a Q&A now, but if you want to make a note of this, you can send us anything. So thank you so much for your time.